Welcome everyone to EDA's 2023 Disaster Supplemental Webinar. I am Craig Berstatti, speaking to you from Washington, D.C. Here at the Economic Development Administration, I serve as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Regional Affairs, where I have the awesome honor and privilege supporting our 6 regional offices across the nation and a number of amazing dynamic program teams that support our regional offices here in Washington, D.C. Today, we're going to focus on the 2023 Disaster Supplemental, how you can participate in that program, things like eligibility, what's available, what types of projects, etc. But before we dive into the details of that, I would like to tell everyone a little bit about EDA. Slide, please. Here, the Economic Development Administration, we focus on supporting place-based bottom-up economic development. We do that through supporting regional innovation, competitiveness in all 50 states and 9 territories across the nation. Perhaps you're coming to us new as an interested stakeholder to participate in our disaster supplemental this year. But one thing that I will want to emphasize is that EDA truly meets the needs of communities wherever they're at in their economic development journey. We have a number of different investment tools that can support things like planning, strategy development. We help build critical infrastructure to support economic development. We help support entrepreneurship and small business support efforts. And of course, here today, we're going to talk about economic support and economic recovery post-disaster. We have been honored and privileged to receive $500 million in recent appropriations to support disaster recovery for the 2021 and 2022 federally declared national disasters. Slide, please. This is, unfortunately or fortunately, not new to us. As the nation experiences more and more disasters, EDA has been increasingly depended on to respond to the needs of our communities. I want to emphasize our role in disaster recovery is and has been on the economic recovery part of that. Since 1990, as you see here, we've been appropriated roughly $3.2 billion. And in recent years, that funding has really increased as the extreme devastating nature of recent disasters has become more common, more economically distressful and dynamic. And I think that's why it's important that Congress has appropriated these resources to help us respond. We have built quite a lot of experience in this work in ranging from hurricane recovery, starting back to the Katrina days in New Orleans, to very recently being activated to support Hurricane Ian recovery in Florida, Puerto Rico, and other parts of the Southeast. But those types of devastating disasters might get more national attention. We're also helping recover economically in communities in much more bounded regions from tornadoes, floods, and more acute wildfires. We truly have a flexible toolkit and are there to support. Slide, please. One of the ways we do that is our Economic Recovery Support Function, or ERSF. As part of the nation's National Disaster Recovery Framework, we, EDA, and the Department of Commerce lead a critical pillar of that, the Economic Recovery Support Function, to help communities respond to, recover, and build resilience post-disaster. As you'll see here, a couple of examples of the work that we do is is try to help communities address a lack of business support post-disaster, but also leading to preparation. Increased business resilience and planning can improve resiliency to future disasters. Access to capital to help businesses recover, respond to those environments is really critical. Infrastructure is always a very common, important pillar of our response, and diversity of economic activity, industries, businesses is a really important part a strategy when considering economic recovery support. And last but not least, capacity. I mentioned earlier the range of work that we do. Sometimes there is limited planning and technical assistance capacity to design, modernize, or scale certain types of economic development strategies and plans. When it comes to recovery and resilience, this really is another important offering of our products or work to help communities build stronger plans. Today, I guess that's at a high level, a little bit about EDA, our work in the disaster recovery and resilience field. I'm going to turn it over to our disaster recovery coordinator, Ms. Naomi Friedman, shortly. The agenda that we're working through today, though, is the following. We'll talk through, Ms. Naomi Friedman, that is, we'll talk through a little bit about basic trends, some important numbers, both in where the impacts are, some eligibility considerations, some strategic considerations with the funding opportunity itself, how you might participate. And then we'll wrap the conversation with an expert conversation with leaders from the field. We'll be joined by two of our experienced senior leaders, our regional directors from the Atlanta and Denver's office, and close with some next steps. Naomi, thanks so much for your expertise and leadership on this effort. Please take it away.
Thank you so much. Next slide, please. Building on Craig's remarks, we are experiencing an increase in the number and severity of natural disasters. 2022 was actually the 8th year in a row where 10 or more separate natural disasters, each costing $1 billion or more, impacted the nation. 2022 was the third most expensive year. It's the reddish orange line on record after 2017 and 2005. 2005 was Hurricane Katrina. We're also observing shorter intervals between major disasters, which means less time and resources to respond, recover, and prepare. This increased frequency of events produces cascading impacts that are particularly challenging to vulnerable socioeconomic groups. Next slide, please. In 2022, there were 18 individual disaster events that each resulted in losses over $1 billion. They're featured here on this slide. Collectively, these catastrophic events resulted in the death of 474 people and combined losses estimated at over $170 billion. So why are we seeing more catastrophic disasters? The number and cost of disasters are increasing for a combination of reasons, including where and how we're growing. Much growth has taken place in vulnerable areas, like on the coasts and in river floodplains, and our building codes also have proven to be insufficient for reducing damage from extreme events. Climate change is also playing a role in the increasing frequency of extreme weather events, including the length of the wildfire season, the potential for extreme rainfall, and drought. Next slide, please. This slide summarizes some of the key elements of the supplemental, which I will go into more detail in future slides. During the last 3 years, EDA received supplementals focused on COVID-19, but this fiscal year, we received $500 million supplemental for natural disasters, of which $483 million is available for granting. The disaster funds are for both infrastructure projects and long-term economic recovery projects, which include planning. First and foremost, this program has slightly different eligibility than our normal funding programs because it's tied to disaster recovery. So to be eligible for funding, the project you are proposing must be located in or substantially benefit a region that had a presidentially declared major disaster that occurred in calendar years 2021 and 2022. We have our typical entities eligible, including district planning organizations, economic development organizations, federally recognized tribes, state and local government, institutions of higher learning, public and private nonprofits, and consortium of those. For-profit entities and individuals are not eligible. EDA typically funds 80% with 20% local cost share. This could be adjusted on a case-by-case basis, depending on a variety of factors and criteria explained in the notice of funding. Next slide, please. Applicants must apply to their EDA regional office. There are 6 EDA regions described here on this slide, and hopefully you can easily see which office you should apply to. Regional allocations, which really means the amount of money that each region has received that it can grant out, are based on a variety of criteria, including impact and distress. Next slide, please. This is a quick visual of areas covered by presidentially declared major disasters that occurred during calendar years 21 and 22. To note, this map does not include U.S. territories, and Puerto Rico and American Samoa both have disaster declarations. You can always reach out to your EDR about eligibility if you're not sure. But I also highly recommend, and next slide please, that you consult the FEMA website. This is quite a resource. FEMA.gov/disaster declarations is particularly helpful for determining eligibility. This interactive tool allows you to search by location, and you can input state or tribe, by declaration type, and we are funding only major disasters, so please indicate major disaster, and then the incident year, and we are looking at 2021 and 2022. To note, declarations for those eligible years may occur after 2022. What I have here is an example from California. Each disaster has a number, and this is an interesting situation because this disaster actually began the very end of 2022, and the declaration happened in 2023. But as I explained before, it is an eligible disaster. Now you will note here that some of the counties are shaded in orange and some in a reddish color. For EDA, all counties that are shaded are eligible. The different colors have to do with different FEMA funding streams, but for EDA, all shaded counties are eligible. The white ones are not. Next slide, please. As we review eligible projects, we will need to consider that each project must substantially benefit or be in a geography subject to presidentially declared disasters in 2021 and 2022. This funding is offered through EDA's most flexible funding program called Economic Adjustment Assistance, or EAA for short. And under this program, a wide range of project types are eligible, ranging from planning, workforce development, entrepreneurship development, revolving loan funds, public works, and infrastructure projects. It's good funding with a lot of flexibility and really helps you advance economic recovery and economic development in your region. I will also note that EDA encourages submissions based on long-term, regionally oriented, coordinated, and collaborative economic development or redevelopment strategies that should foster economic growth and economic resilience, really taking advantage of regional economies, regional clusters, and the like. It's also important that projects are consistent with the region's current comprehensive economic development strategy, or CEDS, or an equivalent document approved by EDA. I want to mention that any project that supports recovery and resilience from the declared natural disasters is eligible. It doesn't have to specifically be about repairing things or replacing things that were damaged in the disasters. Next slide, please. Here you can see a bit more detail on some of the types of projects that are eligible. As you can see, it's a big range. Beginning with planning, there are activities that are eligible that range from feasibility studies, design and engineering studies, and it also includes disaster response, recovery, and resiliency strategies. This could be preparing a new plan, or it could be updating an existing plan. Of course, we also fund economic infrastructure, the development of new infrastructure, repairing or enhancing infrastructure to include energy, transportation, broadband, water, and wastewater. We support the creation of new businesses and jobs, and that's various activities, incubators, industrial parks. It could also include technical assistance. We capitalize and recapitalize revolving loan funds. Workforce development is a priority. And the final note here is capacity building measures. That can really range from training, technical assistance, to actually hiring disaster recovery and resiliency coordinators. Next slide, please. I'd like to mention 3 updates in this notice of funding since our last disaster supplemental. With the trend in increased disasters and economic disruptions, resilience is emphasized in this funding competition. EDA expects every project it funds to be resilient to future disruptions to the greatest extent possible, and that includes the impacts of climate change. We'll get into each of these points in a moment in more detail. Equity is also of greater emphasis in this funding competition. EDA expects projects to advance equity to underserved populations. And workforce development is a high priority of the Department of Commerce. Next slide, please. So what do we mean by resilience? In the economic development context, resilience is the ability of a community or a region to anticipate, withstand, or bounce back from various disruptions to its economic base. Inclusion of resilience principles is a necessary step to improve the capacity of a region to recover more quickly from future disasters. And we ask that proposals and applications demonstrate a consideration of future disruptions. Next slide, please. So what do we mean by future disruptions? We know that, as we discussed before, there's an increased trend in natural disasters. Applicants should account not only for current risks, but also for how the frequency, severity, and nature of these extreme events may evolve in the coming decade. This considers current and future weather patterns, vulnerabilities, and risks. For infrastructure projects, this includes how new infrastructure assets will be designed, built, and operated to be resilient to high-impact weather and climate changes that might occur over the full asset's lifetime. For example, for wastewater systems, you may want to consider more frequent and intense storms, saltwater intrusion, or increased sedimentation levels, which could affect sizing, location, and other design elements. Next slide, please. Here are some examples of economic resilience, and they really fall into two big categories. One is protecting assets from physical climate risks, sea level rise, increased storms, droughts, high heat, and longer wildfire seasons, and also protecting economies from economic transitions that could be caused by climate change and climate disruptions. The second is really thinking about how to take advantage of new economic and job creation opportunities, really thinking about jobs of the future, new technologies, and also fields that might help build climate resilience and renewable energy, green infrastructure, and other opportunities. On this slide are two examples. The first one from Savannah, Illinois, and that was a relocation of a wastewater treatment plant into a safer area. The second is the Choctaw Nation, really looking at economic diversification. I really encourage you to look at the EDA website, particularly under success stories, and you can check the box that says disaster recovery, and you will receive many other examples of projects that EDA has funded, which can help inspire your own applications. Next slide, please. As we discussed, equity is also highlighted in this proposal, in this competition. Underserved and marginalized communities may be particularly vulnerable to the effects of natural disasters and climate change and take longer to recover. So EDA expects projects to advance equity to underserved populations to the extent practicable. A successful project will articulate which populations or communities will benefit and include a plan for inclusive community engagement. I encourage you to look at the notice of funding that has a long list of the underserved and vulnerable populations so that you understand in greater detail what groups we are talking about. Next slide, please. Workforce development is a high priority of the Department of Commerce. I encourage you to look at the Department of Commerce's workforce principles, to really think about demand-driven sectoral partnerships, and to review the notice of funding, particularly pages 7 through 9 that speak about workforce in much greater detail. Next slide, please. So really pulling this all together, and you're going to hear some of the themes that we mentioned throughout, what makes for a strong application? Beginning on page 24 of the notice of funding, you will read about the criteria that EDA uses when it reviews and evaluates applications. There are 13 criteria on this slide and next, which are the ones that we use for construction and non-construction projects, except for sets plans, and that will be on a separate slide. I'm not going to read the whole list, but I do want to call your attention to a few and really encourage you to read that section of the NOFO very carefully. A project will be evaluated on its feasibility and its likelihood of achieving projected outcomes on schedule. It will be reviewed based on its responsiveness to the needs of impacted communities. In the notice of funding, you can read more about examples of regional stakeholders related to item number 3 on this list. And of course, we continue to emphasize resilience in number 5 and job creation in number 7, and projects that can demonstrate their impact. Next slide, please. Here are the last 4 criteria, some of the same themes. We've talked about economic diversification and economic growth. And I want to call your attention to number 13. Proposals are required to meet our recovery and resilience investment priority, but I also encourage you to look at our other investment priorities. Alignment with more than one priority can make your application even more competitive. There are also special criteria to consider for workforce projects and also projects in Puerto Rico. Next slide, please. Here's the list for the comprehensive economic development strategies, many of the same themes that we have been talking about: feasibility, alignment with EDA's investment priorities, and of course, support from regional stakeholders. Next slide, please. On the next 2 slides, we present a variety of tools and websites that could be helpful to you as you prepare your application. This slide is a set of more general tools, and the next one gets a little bit more topical. I want to call out just a few on this list, and we will make sure that you receive the slides so you can find all of the embedded links. The first one here is the FEMA Hazard Mitigation Plan. So just like EDA has our SEDS, FEMA has the Hazard Mitigation Plan. The Hazard Mitigation Plan talks about risks and hazards in particular location, and it can be very informative for preparation of other plans or even for projects. EDA has worked with FEMA to consider how we can take some of the themes from each other's plans to make each plan stronger, and you might want to look at that new resource. I also want to draw your attention down to the second to last bullet, the FEMA's National Risk Index, and then of course EDA's National Economic Resilience Data Explorer, fondly called the NERDI. Hopefully by now, many of you know about the NERDI tool. It's a wonderful resource and looks at all kinds of issues related to vulnerability and risk. It does contain within it FEMA's National Risk Index. So it can be a one-stop shop, or you can go to the FEMA's National Risk Index independently. I want to mention now 2 other tools that are new. It pretty much seems like every time you turn the corner, there's a new tool coming out related to something exciting. And in this case, there are a lot of tools looking at climate change. The 2 that I want to mention are the Climate Mapping Explorer, actually the Climate Mapping for Resilience and Adaptation portal, which is put out by our sister agency, NOAA, and the Department of the Interior. It's the 3rd one on the slide, and it's an interactive portal to explore both current and future climate hazards. You can even put in your project's address in the portal's assessment tool, and you can see how the conditions are projected to change over time. That will help you with the requirement to consider future risk. And if you look at the very bottom, you see Climb RR, and that was put together by FEMA, AT&T, and the Oregon National Lab. And that's a very powerful portal. It looks at 100 different climate variables: temperature, precipitation, lack of precipitation, wind speed, wildfire risk, coastal flooding, drought. It allows for simulations of climate conditions. And then I want to call your attention to something right in the middle, which is ARC-X. And that was put together by EPA as a one-stop shop. And that's not so much a mapping tool. That has strategies and best practices looking at climate adaptation. Next slide, please. And here are a few tools, and I will emphasize that while we think some of these are probably the best tools out there, we encourage you to look at other sources as well. So these are all a menu that you may consult. We're not requiring any one or two of these tools. They're really for you to choose what you think is helpful. I am going to now turn to probably the most interesting part of our panel, which is a visit with our regional directors. Next slide, please. Toward that end, I'd like to introduce Phil Paradise, the regional director from our Atlanta office, and Angie Martinez from our Denver regional office. They're going to visit with you about some really important trends that they're seeing in their region and some advice that they may have for prospective applicants. So I'm going to pitch my first question to you, Phil, which is, how do you feel that the unique requirements of this disaster NOFO in regards to disaster resilience and equity should shape the proposals of potential applicants?
Well, thank you very much, Naomi, and I really appreciate the detail and in which you have addressed this issue so far in this webinar. First of all, as I would tell any applicant, make sure to tell your story. Don't forget to answer the specific questions that are there. And within the framework of the NOFO, please pay attention to the areas discussed that address both resilience and equity. They both have very good guidance for you and items that will be important for you to incorporate within the framework of your application. As far as resilience is concerned, this is something that should be given ongoing thinking and planning for the future. Whether you are in a disaster and a rebuilding mode, or whether you're building new, it's a matter of consequence that we know, as explained to you earlier in this webinar, that disasters are there. They're there to stay in this environment, and what's happening is that they are intensifying and also changing with the climate to more significant events. We are seeing a reminder in this NOFO of the importance of continued and ongoing resilience being built into your project. Always think of the risk associated with the location of your project. Is this an area that is often hit by flooding? If so, how do you address those issues to make it more resilient? How do you harden infrastructure if you're asking for infrastructure? How do you give attention to the probability that the disaster event of a similar nature will happen again in the future? Hardening infrastructure, hardening buildings, and smart design all come into play in these conversations. Furthermore, if you are involved in the planning process, and for those fortunate enough to be in economic development districts where the district prepares the comprehensive economic development strategy for EDA, this should be a part of the ongoing process of on a regional scale that can be drawn down to the individual or locale of the project. Also think in terms of economic diversification as a resilient strategy. You may find that some as opportunities present themselves for new industry or to relocate industry in some fashion, that it can be done to a location that is more resilient, or the industry itself may be more resilient to disasters. For instance, a knowledge-based industry, and that may be what you want to pursue as you identify your economic growth opportunities in the future. Now, as to equity, and Naomi covered a lot of ground on this earlier, this is an administration priority and one which just makes sense. Diversity and inclusion make a good deal, a good locality-owned plan or initiative, a great plan or initiative. Think in terms of opportunities to enhance and strengthen persistent poverty communities. Does this infrastructure or does this project that you want to present, does it have the opportunity to be modified in some slight manner that would allow it to encompass and leverage impacts to a more diverse population? All of these are matters that can be considered and incorporated within your application. Of course, you'll want to present this information in quantitative and qualitative terms. And as for the quantitative terms, this may best be done with a good, solid data analysis. And Angie, I think that transitions the conversation to you very, very, very quickly on some ways that you think data may be used to strengthen an application.
Thank you, Phil, and thank you, Naomi. Absolutely. Data is really critical and will help you make the case for your application. Very important, as you saw evidenced by the list of tools that Naomi went over earlier. But data really helps you understand your community. It'll help you understand what disasters have already impacted the community in the past, what the severity of those impacts were, and what regions or populations were most impacted. It also helps you understand your economy, your population, the workforce, the future risks, and helps you think about how future disasters could impact these factors. So really understanding all of this will help inform the type of project you pursue, the location of the project, and the scale of the project. In addition to the list of tools that Naomi mentioned earlier, which has a lot of analysis and a lot of data that you can use to strengthen your application, I also encourage folks to take a look if their state has a demography office. The state demographer has a wealth of information on labor force, mobility, population, all kinds of information. And then a special shout out to the Argonne National Labs tool that Naomi mentioned, the National Economic Resilience Data Explorer, or NERDI. That tool, really helps communities with local economic recovery and resilience analysis. And it also has a hazard rating for each county that you can take a look at. So I really just think it's important that you compile this data, use it to support the need that you have for your project and the type of project that you're proposing, and then reach out to your economic development representative at EDA, talk with them about your project, what your needs are, what data you're using, and what other data they might point you to really make the case for your project. I also wanted to talk about and have Phil and I both kind of address what types of disasters that we see in our regions and what advice that we have for potential applicants. I know in our region, We are in the middle of the country. We see a lot of severe weather, a lot of flooding, wildfires, and tornadoes. Flooding in particular is often seen as like a slow-moving disaster where with a hurricane, it happens really quickly. It has immediate devastating impacts. The news media covers it. And sometimes in the middle of the country, like we've seen just over the last couple weeks along the Mississippi River, it's a slow-moving disaster where rising temperatures, increased snowmelt, followed by rain, and you get devastating floods that occur up and down the river. Many of these river communities are unfortunately used to flooding. It's more of a matter of how bad is it going to be that year. And I think that that's just why EDA's focus on resilience is so important. As Phil talked about earlier, these communities can always anticipate that there will be more flooding, but focusing on what measures they can take to mitigate the impacts in the future is really important. So my advice is read the NOFO, be honest with yourself about what your needs are for a potential project and what your capacity is to implement that project. And, you know, maybe you just need to start with a planning study or a feasibility study before moving into infrastructure, or maybe you're ready and you need, you know, that infrastructure like Naomi talked about earlier. Maybe it's moving a water treatment plant out of the floodplain. And again, I would suggest talk to your EDR, also talk to your economic development district, as Phil mentioned. They write the comprehensive economic development strategy, and resiliency is built into those strategy, and they can be a great partner for you as well. But Phil, I'll kick it over to you. Your region that you cover faces different types of disasters.
Thank you very much, Angie. Yes, we are fortunate enough to be in the southeast part of the nation. Our 8-state regional area as defined. 6 of those 8 states are located on major water, either the Atlantic Ocean or the Gulf of Mexico. We watch when hurricane season comes because we know it's just a matter of time before there is some kind of impact. Of course, other regions, the Austin Regional Office, Texas and Louisiana, and the Philadelphia Regional Office up the Atlantic coast are all prone to hurricane events, which can be of great significance. We also reside within a tornado belt, much like areas of your region, Angie, and it brings us those very scary moments where disaster is sharp, is quick, typically comes at night, and is extremely devastating in a very almost localized manner, as opposed to the hurricane disasters, which are wide scale, as you noted. Flooding is important, is something that we have to deal with here within our region, as in many other regions, and we have to be very guarded against the moral hazard of building back as usual and where as usual. We have to give some thought in our planning, in our personal actions, and in our community actions as to how we're going to address building back better and building back stronger. From a personal perspective, we have to look at it in terms of what can we insure against, what are our risks that we should be insuring against, and how do we add redundancy to our business record system so that we can respond quicker and with accuracy if and when a disaster does impact our business location. From a community's perspective, assessment of infrastructure is critical. This should be part of the planning process and part of any kind of new building or rebuilding process. Redundancy is a matter of importance as well, and also as you noted earlier, safe places. Where do we locate our business and residential and infrastructure to guard against the potential for such things as flooding, as a good example of that. So zoning becomes an important element of it. Avoiding high-risk locations and also avoiding building back the same way it's always been built back. Think in terms of building better, building stronger, and making a more hardened infrastructure. And when you're working this application, think in terms of what steps can be taken and should be taken to harden the project against risks that are probable and not only possible. And with that, let's hand it back to Naomi.
Thank you both, Angie and Phil. You each raised some really, really critical points. And I think we're ready to take the webinar home with our last slide. And to sum it up, we encourage you all to read the notice of funding very carefully, and especially given some of these new elements that we've been mentioning today that will help you determine if you're eligible. It will also help you think about if you are project ready. So if you have a developed project ready to apply, and also for you to think about some of the other projects that EDA has funded. I do want to pick up on a theme that was mentioned in the RD panel, which is the idea of building back better. So doing things stronger. Please don't feel limited to the types of projects that we have funded before, but they should inspire you and help you understand what are the types of projects that we are looking for, what EDA typically funds, and then of course, do not hesitate to reach out to your economic development representative. You go to our website under contact, you will see the EDR that is assigned to your particular state. Please reach out. And under number 6, we have a link to EDA just released some expanded guidance for the SEDS plans. And there is new climate resilience guidance that speak to some of the topics that we have talked about today. You may find that very interesting. And then of course, make sure that you are registered for EDA's new grant management portal known as EDGE. And with that, I wish you all much success with your applications, and please consult our website, your economic development rep, and we were very happy to be with you today. Thank you so much.